Wow, what a punctuation point to start our discussion today at the Global Security Forum. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor at large of The Hill. And we have a great guest who is referred to in the comments that you just heard from families of hostages and those people that our guests that I'm about to have a conversation with has touched. Let me just say a few words about Ambassador Robert O'Brien, National Security Advisor to President Trump. One of my favorite things about him is he's a Bruin from UCLA. That's something we have in common. Has a distinguished history across the board on U.S. national security law and policy. He was, before his present post, special presidential envoy for hostage affairs and was made an ambassador a year into that job. And since September 18th, 2019, it sort of seems like a lot has happened over that last year and a couple of months. Robert O'Brien has been the fourth national security advisor to the president. So, Ambassador O'Brien, it's terrific to be with you today. And I would love to just get your thoughts and reactions to that video and ask you to share with us as well. What does your dashboard look like? What is your strategic priorities as you go into work every day and you think about the national security priorities of the country? What does that look like?
Well, thank you, Steve, for that generous introduction, and thank you, Ali, for hosting me today. As you know, Ali is an incredible patriot who served our nation with real distinction. In responding to the video, let me just take a moment to tell you how humbled I am to see the Muellers and Diane and Sam Goodwin. They're great Americans, and for the Muellers and the Foleys, I can't imagine the loss and the sense of loss that they have for their kids who were great kids doing amazing things. Kayla was a heck of a humanitarian and had done amazing things in her young life, and I wish I'd had the opportunity to meet her. And the same with Jim Foley, with James Foley, as a great young journalist and who had tremendous potential ahead of him. And Sam is just a terrific, charismatic young man who's got great things ahead of him. One of the things that in this job or in my prior job as a hostage envoy, you don't really think about so much of the people you brought home. And I'm grateful that we've been able working with President Trump and Secretary Pompeo and others and our team, Cash and others, to bring so many people home. But my thoughts are still with the families that have loved ones who aren't home yet. And so every day I continue to think about Austin Tice, for example, or Jeff Woodkey, or the Sitco Six. We've got some detainees in Russia, Whelan, Reed, and Calvi. And so I'm thinking about them and others every day, and we hope to bring them home. And when they're home, we'll have a real opportunity to rejoice. But it was quite an honor to be mentioned, and the extraordinarily generous comments that Sam and Diana and Carl and Marcia had touched my heart, and it's something I won't forget. Let me bring you greetings from the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Over the past 4 years, President Trump has put protecting the American people first, their needs, their safety, their rights, and their values. And he's pursued, as Ronald Reagan did, a policy of peace through strength. He's dealt with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. President Trump has exposed and stood up to malign authoritarian regimes instead of turning a blind eye to their conduct while merely hoping for change. The president has also done the hard work of strengthening our alliance and partnerships. And in so doing so, he has insisted on substance over style, which is something new that we haven't seen for many years. We believe the world is more peaceful and more prosperous in many ways because of the president's policies. One area that the president has had tremendous success on is in counterterrorism and hostage recovery. The ISIS physical caliphate, once the size of Great Britain, is gone. We brought ISIS founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and other top ISIS leaders to justice. And consequently, over 7.5 million people have been freed from ISIS's oppressive rule. We've also brought two Islamic State detainees, the so-called Beatles, back to the United States, where they'll be tried in court for the kidnapping, detention, and brutal execution of 4 American citizens, Sotloff, Mueller, Foley, Kasich. We won't forget them. They'll be brought to justice, and justice will be served on them. Under the president's leadership, the United States has also degraded al-Qaeda, with many of its key leaders dead, including AQIM leader Abdul Malik Drukdal, AQAP leader Qasem al-Rimi, and AQIS leader Azam Umar. Al-Qaeda has been incapable of directing a complex, large-scale attack against the U.S. because of the pressure that we've kept on them, and there's more to come. The Iranian regime, the number one state sponsor of terrorism, is more contained than it has been in years. Its revenue has been reduced to the lowest levels in history by the largest economic pressure campaign since the Cold War. To further this end, the United States has designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. President Trump has also taken unprecedented action against Hezbollah, the world's most heavily armed terrorist group, whose diverse collection of advanced weapons and thousands of rockets and missiles threaten our partner Israel. And for years, Hezbollah has been gathering intelligence, stockpiling weapons, building explosive caches, and plotting attacks in Europe, Asia, Africa, North, and South America. And it sent its senior commanders across the Middle East to oversee operations and exacerbate sectarian tensions. Finally, to supplant its hundreds of millions of dollars it receives from Iran each year, Hezbollah launders money and helps drug cartels move cocaine into Europe and the United States. Under President Trump, there's been no higher priority than the safety and security of American citizens. The U.S. government has worked tirelessly to secure the freedom of Americans and citizens of our allies held in captivity. And since the beginning of the administration, we've rescued over 56 hostages and detainees in more than 24 countries and returned them home to their loved ones. And this unprecedented success has been achieved by leveraging the full weight and scope of tools available to the U.S. government, as well as, in some cases, our allies around the world and our partners in the private sector. And they know who they are, and we're grateful to them. In addition to these important successes, the president has built a new international consensus on China. He's taken unprecedented action to counter Chinese aggression, theft, and human rights abuses, and dramatically expanded our cooperation with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. On the trade front, NAFTA has been replaced with a much improved USMCA. Working with leaders from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, President Trump has reduced undocumented migration from these nations by 85%. We've strengthened our relationship with the hemisphere's second biggest democracy and unlocked billions of dollars in loans to small and mid-sized enterprises and infrastructure projects in Brazil and other places in the Western Hemisphere through our America Cresce, or Growth in the Americas initiative. I was just in Brazil at President Trump's request just a week before the election to help cement that alliance with our critical ally in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil. It's a vast and populous democracy, and America is going to will be stronger because of that partnership that we have with Brazil and President Bolsonaro. President Trump convinced our NATO allies to increase their defense spending by $400 billion to 2024. After years of devastating defense sequestration here at home, our military is being rebuilt. We signed a peace agreement with the Taliban after 19 years of war. And with America's help, Serbia and Kosovo normalized their economic relationship. In the Middle East, an area that many of you are familiar with, President Trump achieved a truly historic peace agreement between the United Arab Emirates, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Israel. We call them the Abraham Accords in English, or the Avram Accords in Hebrew, or the Ibrahim Accords in Arabic. They represent the most significant step forward in peace in the Middle East in over 25 years. Diverse challenges to our national security remain, from Russia to Iran to North Korea to Venezuela to the continued threat of extremist terrorism to transnational criminal organizations. But the results of the president's policy speak for themselves. We're safer than when the president took office. The fight for security and freedom goes on. Ali and many of you here are heroes in that fight, and it's a fight we must stay in no matter what happens on the political front in the United States. Thank you. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America. And Steve, with those opening remarks, I'd love to have a conversation with you and answer some of the questions you might have.
Great. Well, Ambassador O'Brien, thank you. You covered a lot of turf, so I think we'll work on unpacking some of that. But let me ask you first about hostages and where they sit as a priority in our national security thinking. And what I'm specifically interested in is oftentimes we see shadowy groups who have kidnapped, detained, killed, harassed people. But if you look just beyond those shadowy groups, they're often governments pulling the strings. What are we doing to deter this as an act essentially of states and non-state actors?
No, that's a great question. And oftentimes we divide hostages into two categories. Hostages, which are taken by non-governmental actors, the JNIMs, the Al-Qaedas, the ISISs of the world, and detainees. They might be held by Russia. They might be held by Iran, Syria, or another bad actor. I think the president cut through a lot of this. When I first started working with him in my prior position, he just referred to them as all hostages. If they were an American who was taken by a government or by an organization, maybe an organization that had a state sponsor behind them, Uh, his position is they were hostages. They were being used as bargaining chips in some way to either humiliate the U.S. or to punish someone just because of their status as a U.S. citizen, or an attempt to gain ransom for an organization so that they could further their terrorist goals or their criminal activities. And the president's position was, and I think this is the essence, when people ask what America first means, I don't think there's any place uh, outside the hostage world or the detainee world where it's a more pure distillation of how the president feels about getting our folks home. And he doesn't care why they were there, what they were doing when they were taking hostage. He doesn't care about their background. He doesn't care about their political affiliation, their religion. If there's an American who's taken overseas, he wants them home. And I think that he's personally offended that either a government or a terrorist organization would take an American hostage. And so he's made it literally one of the top priorities. I don't think we've ever seen a president put the return of wrongful detainees or hostages at the top of his foreign policy agenda or his national security agenda. But it makes sense because when the president spends so much time and effort on individual Americans who are taken abroad, our adversaries understand that he means business, and our friends know that he's gonna put American interests first. And I don't think there's a more important American interest than getting our citizens home when they've been wrongfully taken.
One of the high-profile cases that you mentioned in your earlier comments is one that's unresolved, and that is the case of Austin Tice. Many people think that he's held in Syria. There have been reports of high-level talks with Syria on a number of fronts, but also hostages. Reports that Kash Patel, who's now, of course, rising in the Department of Defense, and others has been involved in this. Where do those talks stand now? And do you see a pathway? And let me just ask you candidly: have the Syrians finally admitted to having the influence to potentially get Austin Tice released?
Yeah, so Steve, those are all great questions, and I'd love to talk more to you and to the viewers on this, but I can't really comment on what's happening at this point. I know there have been press reports about high level interactions, and that Mr. Patel and Ambassador Carsons, who took my job as the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, were in Syria. What I can tell you is that we're using every tool, every lever we have to get Austin out. It's been something I've thought about every day as the hostage envoy, and every day as national security advisor, is how we get Mark and Deborah's son back to them, get him back to his friends and family in Texas. It's been a very frustrating case, but we're using every tool, whether it's through allies, whether it's through adversaries, whether it's we're doing everything we can to get Austin back, and we would like to get him back. And I'd like to see him back, and I know the president would like to see him back before he leaves office. But I can't comment further on the case at this time.
I understand that, and I think we all wish you well in those efforts. Let me ask you another question. I'm sort of, I don't know where the audience is, and we may lose them in this, but I'm a real nerd and wonk when it comes to studying the National Security Council over many years under very different leaders, and I am interested in how you see the national security decision-making process. Who needs to be in the room? How is it structured? Of course, we recently lost Brent Scowcroft, who many people I knew very well, but many people look at him as one of the ideal national security advisors. And I'd just be interested in how you compare the way you've structured the decision-making process with maybe, let's pick a few, Susan Rice, Zbig Brzezinski, Brent Scowcroft. What does a president need and expect and should have in the structural dimensions of national security decision making?
Well, when you reel off those names, the people that have held the office before me, I think I'm the 28th national security advisor, and there have been just some giants in American national security and foreign policy who've sat in that office. Many of them have been extraordinarily kind in sharing their wisdom with me and talking about how to organize the National Security Council. One of the things I did is when I first took office is I reached out to a number of my predecessors, starting with Henry Kissinger and going down, and predecessors from both sides of the aisle, to ask them their thoughts and to get their insight. The one thing I wanted to do, and all of them confirmed it, is I wanted to follow the model that Brent Scowcroft had for the National Security Council. I think he was a very effective national security advisor. Now, I didn't want to be a cliche, though, because every national security advisor who comes into office, as you know, Steve, having followed this, the first thing they say is, we're going to have the Scowcroft model, in our National Security Council, and they may or may not have the Scowcroft model, but everyone, that's almost like a religious incantation. But I took a look at what Brent did. I talked to folks who worked with Brent on either his executive secretary, his deputies, or others, and I think there are a couple of things that exemplify the Scowcroft model. Number one is being an honest broker. I don't think you can have your own agenda as the national security advisor. And I think when you have your own agenda, you're pushing your own agenda, it makes you less effective as a convening power. I mean, the power I have as a senior staffer to the president is to bring together the cabinet secretaries, the department heads, try and get their very best views on an issue, to get their very best advice for the president, to get their counsel on what course of action we should take, whether it's a long-term problem or a crisis that we're facing that day, and then get those options to the president. Hopefully we can arrive at some consensus, but if there's not a consensus, to get them their day in court. And to do that, I think being an honest broker elicits the views and elicits the good faith arguments from the various folks that we're working with, the men and women who make up the cabinet. So that's number one. Number two goes to this idea of having your day in court. You're not always going to have a consensus on these issues, and if you did, it probably wouldn't be a great process. You really want some give and take, especially when you're dealing with some of these critical issues of the day, whether it's China or Russia or Iran or Syria or international terrorism or transnational organized crime. Different departments have different equities, different cabinet secretaries or department heads look at things differently. And so that having a process whereby they can get together, have their views exchanged, and then understand that if they're on the minority, that they'll get their day in court with the president, or with the national security advisor if it's depending on the issue, or with the president if it's a big enough issue to go to his desk. And so I think what we've tried to do is run a very effective process. We've had, I think, almost half the deputies committee meetings and principal committee meetings that have been held during the Trump administration have taken place over the past 15 months while I've been national security advisor. I think it's important to get everyone together to hear their views. And then we've had many occasions where there was a split in opinions where we go to the president. And again, by being the honest broker and taking that to the president and letting the senior officials give voice to their case, to argue their case to the president, to have their day in court. The president may ask me to weigh in later, but I try and make sure that he gets the views directly from his cabinet folks. And I think the third part of the Scowcroft model, if you take being an honest broker and running an efficient process and giving folks their day in court, is for the NSC not to be operational. There's a little twist on that under PPD 30 with hostages, where we're maybe a little bit more operational on the hostage front than we would be in other areas. But that is, our job is to convene, to get the president the best advice and options, and then to let the departments and agencies implement those policies. The State Department's much better suited to do international diplomacy than the NSC. Now, that doesn't mean I won't meet with my counterparts, other national security advisors. I might meet with heads of state on behalf of the president. But the day-to-day diplomacy of the United States should be run by the State Department. Our military operations should be run by the DoD. Our Homeland Security operations by the Department of Homeland Security. Our counterterrorism and counterintelligence should be run by the FBI and DOJ. So I think that's the third part of it, is not to have an operational NSC where you're recreating a mini Department of State or a mini Department of Defense over on West Exec Avenue next to the White House, but to make sure that excuse me, once the president has made a decision and has had a policy, that policy is implemented by the department. So I think those are three of the hallmarks of the Scowcroft model, and we've really we've strived to do to operate the NSC in that fashion. And I was just recently with Governor Huntsman out in Utah speaking at the Orrin Hatch Foundation, and one of the kindest compliments that I've been paid in this job is. And he's worked with, I think, 7 or 8 national security advisors. He's been a 4-time ambassador. He said he hasn't seen a National Security Council since Brent Scowcroft run with the, quote, Scowcroft model the way we've been able to pursue it. And look, that's not a credit to me. That's a credit to the president and empowering us to do it, and a credit to the team that we put together at the NSC that has been able to operate in that fashion. So I owe a lot to Brent. It was a tough loss, but he was General Scowcroft was really a giant in the national security world, and so I couldn't have been more proud to hear people say that we've done something similar to what he did. It's quite a compliment.
I'm glad to hear John Huntsman's comments. John's an old friend, and I know that he does not flatter. So
No.
that's even, it speaks even better to his comments. Let me just say something. You raised something I think is very important. Talking about the non-operational. Many of us in the media, I'm in the media. We're always looking for collisions, fights. Personality contests. Looking at what does John Bolton and his worldview bring. But what you said is very, very important, and I think it's important that people understand and hear it. Is that I get this sense, and I want to ask you about this, that you are elevating other people's views. You are elevating, Mark Milley's views, with whom you are reported to have some differences. My question to you is, do your views matter at the end of the day as a person, an individual in this process? And do you find yourself able to still be a good steward of those with whom you disagree as you bring those decisions to the president? So it's really kind of an interesting thing, because I just talked to General Scowcroft, and he said, yeah, I had views, I had differences, but it didn't mean that I undermined the views of others. So just love to get your take on that.
No, look. I think that's a great question. I think it's one of the things that the national security advisor has to decide at the beginning of their tenure how they're going to operate. And look, I've got well-developed opinions on lots of issues. I've published hundreds of articles and op-eds over the years. I've spoken out. Every once in a while, somebody will go find a prior speech or a news clip from CNN or Fox or something and put it on Twitter to show what I said 4 or 8 years ago, or in another presidential campaign, perhaps. And so, look, I've got well-developed views on a lot of the issues that we face, but my role is not to promote my views. My role is to promote the president's policies. And for the president to make the best decisions, he's got to get the input from his chief advisors, whether it's Mark Milley, who's a close friend, and I don't think Mark and I have had any disagreements. What happens with the press is there's this effort in Washington. They always want to have a protagonist and antagonist, and put together some sort of
It's what we do.
and again, I'm not blaming them, but there was a lot written about Mark Esper and myself. I never wanted Mark Esper's job. I just wanted to see Mark Esper succeed and do a great job as Secretary of Defense. And but there were stories about me being in some sort of an adverse relationship with Mark, or with Mark Milley, both of whom I consider to be friends and good men. Uh, so I think that's kind of a Washington thing. My goal is to make sure that the president gets the views of his cabinet. Now, there are many times that the president will then turn to me at the end of a discussion, or it may be in private, that he'll turn to me and say, "What do you think? What's your opinion?" And look, that's my role as the national security advisor, is to then answer president's question, give him my best advice. It's something I did as in a different field as a lawyer for much of my career. And I always tried to make that advice as confidential as possible. And but again, it was guided by what the president's instincts were. And there were times my advice might be something different than what the president ultimately did, and that's fine. That's not something I should that's not something to emphasize or to make a dispute out. The president is the decider. He's elected by the American people. I'm hired by him to staff him and to give him the best advice I can. And once the president makes a decision, that's what we go out and move out and try and implement.
I mean, I don't mean this next question facetiously, although it may sound like that. He's gone through four national security advisors. So, General Mike Flynn, we had General H.R. McMaster, we had John Bolton. Each brought a very different style. H.R. was famous for, lots of charts and numbers. And I'm just interesting. It does appear to outsiders who watch you in this role that you are more successful in getting the president's attention and direction. So, what can you share with us works with the president? What is the secret of your success? Do you use pie charts?
So look, the president is a voracious consumer of intelligence and the information that we provide him. And so he looks at charts, he looks at maps. I think he's got a very innate sense of geography, and so he'll spend a lot of time poring over maps and charts and that sort of thing. But again, that's to convey information to him. It's not for me to try and shape his worldview. One of the things that and I normally don't mention what the president and I discussed, but I'll make an exception here. When I spoke with him about the job and whether I was the right candidate for the job, I was pretty upfront with him and said, "You've hired a couple of national security advisors prior to me that felt it was their job to educate you about the world, to shape your views, to tell you what you ought to be thinking. I don't view the National Security Advisor's role as being some sort of tutor on international affairs. The president's a very accomplished man. He's had a long international business career. He'd been president of the United States for 3 years. When I joined him as National Security Advisor, I'd been working with him prior in a different capacity.
Mm.
I said, you've got a well-developed sense of what you want to do. I view my job as making sure you get all the best options you have that are available for you to implement the policy that you want. And so I think maybe it was a different approach than my predecessors, and good men all, but I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm not there as the principal. The president is the principal in this equation, and I'm there to get him the best options, to give him the best advice, and to give him my most candid best advice, but in private, not leaking it out to the news media about the fact that I felt one way, the president felt a different way. My effectiveness, I think, comes from the fact that he can rely on me to give him good advice, to get him the best options, and then to implement his policies.
Thank you. That I want to try something else. And I want to mention, which I failed to do before, because not only have you written like tons of articles out there, you wrote a book in 2016 titled "While America Slept: Restoring Leadership to a World in Crisis." And so I want to ask you about the Abraham Accords, and as you said, the Abraham Accords, depending on where you sit on this, and wondering, because a lot of people and observers. Council on Foreign Relations types, the Chinese government, see America in some kind of strategic contraction. We can debate that one way or another. But this is something where you're kind of looking at the Middle East and a changing of the map there. Ambassador Yusuf Otaiba said they felt they needed to take action both to change the dynamic in the region, but also stop the annexation of the West Bank. I'm interested in that dynamic, in whether or not you think there's going to be a different vector forward now in the Abraham Accords, and how you saw that as the pieces were coming together.
Well,
and whether it's an example of American leadership reasserting itself.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's a tremendous example of American leadership, and I don't think the Accords would have happened without American leadership. I mean, when you think of 70 years of modern Israeli history from the partition in 48 until now, up until recently, there had only been two peace accords, the peace accord with Jordan and the peace accord with Egypt, two neighbors. 26 years since the Jordanian deal had been done. And I think it was common wisdom in kind of the establishment foreign policy circles and among colleagues and friends of mine that you had to solve the Palestinian problem first before you could get to any other peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And I think President Trump approached this very differently. The first thing he did is he built political capital. He built political capital in Israel by moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's something every presidential candidate from both parties for 40 years has promised to do. But as soon as they get into office, they're told, well, you can't do it. It'll be bad for the street. There'll be uprisings. It'll be terrible for America. And the president said, look, I made this promise. I'm going to keep the promise. I'm going to move the capital to Jerusalem. He recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. I mean, the idea that Israel was ever going to give back the Golan Heights as strategic territory to Bashar al-Assad or whoever comes after him in Syria was ridiculous. That was never going to happen, and we recognized the reality of it. So he built a tremendous amount of political capital there. On the Gulf Arab front, he pulled out of the disastrous JCPOA, which was the worst form of appeasement that the West has engaged in since Munich. I mean, it's. I'm not going to go through the details on it. I've written about it. It was a terrible deal to give the Iranian regime, the number one state sponsor of terrorism, $150 billion in sanctions relief, plus a bunch of cash for hostages. Only encouraged their bad behavior, and we saw it in Yemen, we saw it in Syria, we saw it in Iraq. We've seen it in Lebanon, Yemen, throughout the region. So the president built political capital by standing behind our allies in the Gulf: UAE, Saudi, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, which is a little bit of the Switzerland in the Middle East. But we showed our allies in the Gulf that we'd stand behind them. We got out of JCPOA. We supported them against Iran. And then the president did something very unique for politicians. And I've watched politicians for my entire adult life. They get some political capital, and they want to nurture it, and they want to look at it, and they want to lock it away in a cupboard, and then they open it every once in a while and take a look at the political capital. Politicians have a very difficult time spending their political capital, and that's just what the president did. First of all, he used the political capital he developed with the Israelis, and worked them very hard not to extend sovereignty and not to annex portions of the West Bank. and to set the stage for a potential deal with the Arabs. He uses political capital with the Arab countries because of all the security that we provided him to let them know, hey, this is something that's very important to us. And he brought the parties together. And we got these historic accords, and we had 3 deals done in the course of a month, something that had more deals than had been done in 70 years. And it was really a testament to the president's leadership. It had the effect of isolating Iran. It had the effect of showing that America is still the leader in the Middle East when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to economic leadership. And I also want to comment, it's just not about the president. I want to call out King Hamad and Mohammed bin Zayed and Prime Minister Hamdouk, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Look, it's very dangerous to make peace in the Middle East. We saw that with Anwar Sadat. We saw that with Yitzhak Rabin. People have literally given up their lives as they've attempted to obtain peace. And so those leaders, MBZ and Hamid and Hamdouk and Netanyahu, they showed a tremendous amount of personal courage, not just political courage, but they showed personal courage in entering into these deals. And now to see what's happening, we've got what I call a warm peace. I mean, the peace between Israel and Jordan and Egypt were maybe can be characterized as cold peaces. No war, which is great, diplomatic relations, but not a lot of interaction between the people. We're seeing these flights now going back and forth. We've got Emirati Airlines flying into Emirates, flying into Israel. We've got El Al flying into Abu Dhabi. We have tourists coming to both places. We have Arab religious pilgrims coming to the Temple Mount and coming up to the Al Aqsa Mosque and the Blue Mosque on the Temple Mount to see one of the holiest sites in Islam. Making a Hajj, if you will, there, just like they can do with Mecca and Medina. We're seeing investment taking place between the countries. These great sovereign wealth funds in the UAE are investing in tech companies in Israel. This is all happening very quickly, and I think it's going to be a legacy of the Trump administration. This peace that's breaking out. And look, we think, and I hope that if the current lawsuits don't work out for the president and President Biden becomes our next president, I really hope that a Biden-Harris administration is going to pursue the Abraham Accords, because there are a number of other countries that are teed up to join. And look, it's a signal to Iran, it's a signal to our adversaries around the world that America is back in the game, and that we really can help foster peace. And it's a great legacy for the president to have as he leaves office.
Well, look, you and I studied poli-sci in the same place, continuity, discontinuity. And I think what you just said about the opportunity for continuity here is very important. Just really fast, depending on how you look at it in this whole thing, if you've just got a couple of months left, you think you'll be able to solve the embargo of Qatar and create peace there? Because it is a little ironic that our other partner in the region, where our biggest military base in the region, that flights there, private flights, commercial flights, are dependent upon Iran. So I'm just wondering, will you think there'll be any kind of resorting of that, which I know has also been an interest of yours?
No, we've been working very hard on that. The president's made countless calls to the leaders of the Gulf states. It's in our interest to have the GCC come together. It's in our America's interest to have harmonious relationships within the GCC, because that provides an important counterbalance to Iran. It would open up the opportunity for more peace deals with Israel and creating a real economic opportunity zone across the Middle East, and even being able to take that out to other parts of the Muslim and the Arab world. So we'd like to get that rift solved. We felt that solving the Airlink issue that you referred to, that making sure that Qatar Air that Qatar was able to fly over Saudi airspace or Bahraini airspace is an important first step in solving that rift. I'd like to see that get done before, if we end up leaving office, I'd like to see that get done in the next 70 days. And I think there's a possibility for it. We're in a unique position because we've got great relations with Qatar. I've spent a lot of time in Doha, as a lot of folks on this call probably have, and spent a lot of time in Abu Dhabi and in Riyadh. And so, look, these are all cousins. These are friends. This is really kind of a family dispute. And like family disputes, sometimes those are the hardest to solve. But we'd like to get all these cousins back together at the Thanksgiving table, so to speak. And it's something we're working on, and we're going to keep working on it as long as the president's in office. It's something that'll be a priority for us.
Well, that's great. I want to ask you about something else. You recently put out a very strong statement on China and Hong Kong, and you basically said, there's two systems. One China policy has become a fig leaf for dictatorship. There have been a lot of comments that have been unambiguous about the concerns that the U.S. government and a lot of its allies have about Chinese intellectual property theft. Actions in the South China Sea, actions with sort of techno competition, Huawei, etc. And I want to ask this not about China as the boogeyman, but the question of what do you do as a serious way in response? And just as a friendly critique from an outsider, where I see the posture on China where it is, what I'm wondering is we don't if we don't have a domestic alternative to Huawei, what is the U.S. industrial policy plan? What are we doing with allies to put money, technology, resources, defense structures in place so that we're not just posturing and complaining, but we're actually creating a different set of capacity? I know that's a somewhat of a loaded question, but I know you spent and your deputy Matt Pottinger think a lot about China and this coming competition or this competition now. But I'd like to see where the muscle is in that.
Yeah, so it's a great question, Steve. And one of the things that we've done for the past 40 years, and everybody in the foreign policy establishment, is we kind of turned a blind eye to China. If there were human rights abuses, Tiananmen Square, Hong Kong, Tibet, bullying of Taiwan, now the most recent attacks on India on the line of actual control up in the Himalayas, we've turned a blind eye. We've turned a blind eye to Chinese economic activity, the manipulation of the renminbi, the dumping, the unfair trade practices. We've turned a blind eye to intellectual property theft. We've turned a blind eye to all these things, or turned the other cheek, so to speak, because we thought the conventional wisdom as China became richer, as China became more powerful, they become more like us. And it was really a Western conceit. I mean, I think looking back on it, it was a very arrogant approach to China that they would become wealthy and middle class, and then immediately they become liberal Democrats and quote responsible stakeholders in the world. That obviously hasn't happened, and we can see it with what's happened most recently with what's happened with Hong Kong. They've extinguished freedom in Hong Kong. The Sino-British Declaration had the effect of an international treaty. It's deposited with the UN. We were supposed to have one country, two systems. The people of Hong Kong were supposed to have freedom until at least 2047. And again, the idea was by 2047, China will be a democracy, and so it'll be an easy integration. The freedom was quashed because China couldn't have the competition of a free, prosperous Hong Kong within China that other Chinese could see as they were being oppressed with a total information awareness surveillance state that's been built that is something that Stasi in East Germany could have only dreamed of having with the way that the Chinese people are monitored and assigned social credit scores based on their loyalty to the party or their perceived acquiescence in the party's goals. So they quashed freedom in Hong Kong. What we're trying to do is stop them from doing that internationally. So it's bad enough if the Communist Chinese Party monitors all their own people, creates social credit scores on their own people, hoovers up all their data, whether it's text messages or social media or medical records or financial records. I mean, every intimate photos, every piece of information about a person is collated. And it used to be that you couldn't do much with that because the information was so overwhelming with 1 billion people. It would be like accumulating. It would be like putting it in a warehouse in the old Indiana Jones movie where you had just boxes and to go try and find it and collate it would be impossible. But now with machine learning, with AI, with the cloud, the Chinese have become very adept at putting together a total surveillance society. They're now moving outside of China to do that around the world. And they want to have a file on every single one of us. And in fact, for many of us, I'm sure you, me, others that are in positions that they think are influential, they already have those files. We know that the Washington Post has been publishing the profiles that they're putting together. And they'll eventually have a social credit score on everybody in the world. And then they'll use that to manipulate us. I mean, we saw what happened with the Houston Rockets when the general manager had the temerity to support the protesters in Hong Kong, and the Houston Rockets were banned from TV in China, and you had other NBA stars groveling to the Chinese and the NBA groveling to the Chinese. That's how the Chinese want to run the world, and we've got to stop it. One way we can stop it is by preventing Huawei from becoming the technological backbone of 5G, which would give the Chinese backdoors to pull up every bit of data in the world. And we've been very successful in the Trump administration in stopping that. We've turned countries from the UK to Australia to India to Japan to Italy. Even Germany now is having second thoughts about Huawei. Now, We've got American products that are coming online that are going to be, with cloud computing, with companies like Dell and Microsoft and Oracle and others that'll Qualcomm that will have 5G, either products or complementary products for 5G. Ericsson and Nokia are not, are Scandinavian countries, are not American companies. I feel like I've been an unpaid spokesperson for Ericsson and Nokia for the last year and a half, and I should probably have a Nokia phone myself. But
And they need
the
support. You
it,
know, yeah.
it's, look, it's an incredible thing. But what's happened is the West is slowly awakening to what's happening. And we now have dozens and dozens of countries that have decided they're going to work with trusted providers. And what that means is they're not going to have ZTE, they're not going to have Huawei, they're not going to have the Chinese Communist Party in the backbone of their telecommunication systems. And what's been interesting is what's turned them hasn't been they're going to
Mm.
steal your national secrets. They're going to steal U.S. intelligence that we provide you on counterterrorism or on Russian threats or Chinese threats. What's really turned, especially the Europeans, but also many of the Asians, is the fact that their personal private data is going to be owned 100% by the Chinese Communist Party. And think of what you could do with that from a micro-targeting standpoint in an election. If you know if you know their hopes, if you know their fears, if you know who's having an affair, if you know who's been diagnosed with cancer, if you know who's having financial difficulties, if you know what someone's dream vacation is, think of taking all that information and then on a micro basis being able to target that person, to blackmail them, to entice them, to
Sure.
attempt to influence them. If you believe in democracy and you're concerned about our elections, that's the number one concern that we've got going forward, and that all the democracies have, is what China could do with that a Huawei backbone in our countries. It's really quite scary.
That's great. Ambassador, I've got three quick questions and we've got like 3 minutes. So I want to go, one of the things that may have happened, I don't know, but would love to get your thoughts. We don't have any claims thus far about Russian intervention in this election. So my question is, did Cyber Command, did Paul Nakasone, did your shop send a signal to finally create the first evidence of deterrence in the cyberspace?
Look, we worked very hard on this. We had over 60 PCs and DCs at the NSC. I personally went out to Nikolai Patrushev and met him in Geneva. My Russian counterpart is very close with Vladimir Putin, and let him know that interference in our election day activities would be a red line. And look, the men and women of Cyber Command, but not just Cyber Command. I went out on one occasion to the Iowa National Guard, and they have a cyber unit, and a bunch of smart men and women who are normally CIOs or CTOs for their companies in Iowa, headquartered in those in the great cities of Iowa. On the weekends, they're weekend warriors, weekend cyber warriors. They stood up their unit and supported the Iowa Secretary of State. We had that happening with Guard units around the country. So
Right.
it was a combination of sending out very clear signals to our foreign counterparts, not just Russia, but other countries, China, Iran, others, but also making sure that we'd hardened our infrastructure to the extent we could to avoid that kind of problem.
We're going to have to, eventually have another hour together because I know you're a Navy guy. I know you're thinking a lot about the future of our platforms out there militarily. And I hate asking you in a minute to describe what you think we ought to be doing in terms of reforming the military, looking at our, posture when it comes to ships and, naval craft. But I want to give you that opportunity.
I'll be quick. More subs, more frigates, aircraft carriers with longer reach, with UAVs that can do long range strike from our aircraft carriers that put us out of the A2 AD bubble and allow us to affect the environment. And look, the high ground in the future is going to be space. And the president created the Space Force, the first new branch of the armed forces in 70 years, and cyber. So we're going to have to look at things going forward. We're going to have some short, sharp conflicts that are going to be cyber driven, space driven, where the ultimate high ground, and where our Navy and Air Force and Army are going to be interlinked, so that we're using multiple platforms to achieve our ends. We're going to have to be more joint and more focused on cyber and space. Absolutely.
And then finally, you've already sort of referenced it a little bit. I know it's still complicated, but the question is, do you think if things continue as they look, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris come in and their national security team comes in, are you preparing a healthy transition with them? Are you thinking about that? And then finally, I just want to open the door to any op-eds that you might want to send to the Hill.
Well, I'll still in office, so I'll probably hold off on the op-eds for a while. And I want to give, if there is a new administration, like, they deserve some time to come in and implement their policies. We may have policy disagreements, but look, if the Biden-Harris ticket is determined to be the winner, and it's, obviously things look that way now, we'll have a very professional transition from the National Security Council. There's no question about it. They're going to have very professional folks who are coming in to take these positions, many of whom have been here before and spent a lot of time in the White House in prior administrations. And the great thing is, this is the United States of America. We've passed the baton and had peaceful, successful transitions, even in the most contentious periods. Even, I'm old enough to remember Bush v. Gore, and the transition there didn't start until mid-December, and yet it got done. And if we're in a situation where we're not going to a Trump second term, which I think people here where I'm sitting in the White House would like to see, if it's another outcome, it'll be a professional transition. There's no question about it.
Well, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, it's been a real pleasure, and I want to tell people that you can go out and get what he was thinking a few years ago in his book, While America Slept: Restoring Leadership in a World in Crisis. I'm really interested in what the next volume will be, because there certainly, hopefully, will be a next volume. But Ambassador O'Brien, thank you so much, and I want to also thank you on behalf, that powerful video we saw at the beginning. Those families, I knew James Foley. James Foley was taken with a colleague of mine from the Atlantic in Libya. When my chairman, David Bradley, at that time when I was there, got involved in this thing, and it's just been an
And by the way,
ongoing nightmare for so many people.
David's another great humanitarian who believes in getting our hostages back, and has been a colleague of mine in these efforts as well. And no, look, it was touching and heartwarming to hear from them. And again, we're going to try and get some more folks home before my term ends.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Steve. Take care.